Hello, everybody, and welcome to our virtual talk today. I am Matthias Maschat from Exploratorium Berlin, and I'm very happy to welcome Bob Ostertag, live from San Francisco. Welcome, Bob. Great that we set up this conversation together, which I'm really very much looking forward to. Just maybe let me say a few words in the beginning. As an introduction. It was New Year's Day that I received an email from Bob. And actually, it was the first email that I read in 2021. And I thought, wow, that's really a great start of the year, receiving an email from Bob Ostertag. And in this email, Bob inquired me about the possibility to spread the word about his new book, which is called Facebooking the Anthropocene in Raja Ampat, Techniques and Civilization in the 21st Century. And I can show you how it looks like. This is it. Okay. I actually don't have a physical copy here already because it will only come out in May. Is that correct? You have one? Okay.
There you go.
Okay, it's out in print already.
It's backwards. Is the
Ah,
type backwards there?
uh,
Here, hold on. I
no.
can
It's
flip that
perfect. It's
over.
perfect like this.
Okay.
You can, yeah.
All right.
It's totally correct.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so it's already available in the bookstores, and it's also available as digital download. Um, there's info on the YouTube page of this live stream, by the way, so you can look it up there. Yeah, how did it come that Bob approached me? We knew from another Berlin venue called Ausland, where I had set up two concerts of him a few years ago in the course of my series Biegung im Ausland in 2014 and 2015. Yeah, great performances, by the way. But what I guess Bob wasn't aware of is that I am now also working for Exploratorium Berlin, which is a space entirely dedicated to the art of improvisation. And it's here that I am responsible for our theory and research department, where among other things, I set up events and talks around the subject of improvisation. It's called Denkraum Improvisation, which translates as thinking space improvisation. And with today's talk, I'm actually starting a new series under the title Leeways. So this is today Leeways #1, Bob Ostertag, Facebooking the Anthropocene in Raja Ampat. Well, there's so much to say about Bob Ostertag's biography and his work, so that I really don't exactly know where to begin with. He started his career in the 70s with the use of analog synthesizers without a keyboard, within free improvisation contexts. And it is truly incredible what has all developed from this since then. Many know him as a musician, but Bob is also a versatile writer, and he has published 7 books. And of course, he's also known for his work as political journalist and activist. If I may add this personal story, I came across Bob Ostertag for the first time when I discovered the Fred Frith documentary Step Across the Border in the middle of the 90s. And I totally fell in love with the Norgarden Nivla piece played by the band Keep the Dog, where Bob is adding an absolutely hilarious intro on his sampler. If you don't know it, check it out. It's fantastic. Yeah, and then I was happy to get the chance to set up concerts with him finally, and now to even get the chance to talk about Bob's work with him. So let's go into it, I would say. Bob, what I find so remarkable about your work in general is its incredible diversity, and I must say I don't really find this in any other musician in the field we are working in. I mean, you started as a musician, played with some of the most influential improvisers, and you on your own developed very unique ways of using modular synthesizers in the scene. But then you turned your back to music and continued as activist and political journalist in Central America for about 10 years. Then you came back to music, but you always stayed with writing since then. Published several books, as I said, and on very different subjects. And you also continue to work as a political journalist. And as if this wasn't enough, you were professor of cinema and digital media at the UC Davis till last August. And you even produced a film on your own and so on. I won't go into further details right now myself, but I would like to know from you how all this connects for you. Is it simply all part of a creative life for you? How did all this develop parallel to each other?
You know, my rule of thumb is always do the thing that's most interesting to you at the time. So you just follow the thread, and whatever is the most compelling thing, you grab onto that and hold onto it tight and follow it. And so it's funny, from inside of my head, the whole trajectory seems like a sort of obvious path, but I realize that from outside it seems quite scattershot. Yeah, but I do love to write, and more and more I think writing is more and more my focus, because musically the music I ended up specializing in was pretty technology intensive, and as I get older, keeping up with the technology becomes less interesting for me. But thinking about the technology becomes more interesting, and I can think about it through telling stories about it, through watching how people use it, and maybe watching how it uses people, and telling those stories. So, and to tell the stories, all I need is a pencil and a piece of paper, or I don't know, Microsoft Word on any old laptop or anything. So, so yeah, writing is where I find my creative joy right now, for sure.
And when you are reading Bob's books, you really sense the joy of writing which is in there. So it's once you start reading it, you can't really put it aside anymore. It's really capturing. So you said now that you focusing on other things. Maybe we could go back a little bit to the beginnings. Can you tell me something about your beginnings as a musician? How did you find your path to improvisation, to freedom in music, creativity, experimenting, and so on? So did you directly focus on this, or how did that come?
Well, I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and it was sort of the rock and roll moment. And so, of course, from the minute I saw Jimi Hendrix, I was like, okay, can I go where he is, hang out with him, listen to that? Yeah, so I played electric guitar, and then I started adding foot pedals to the electric guitar, and pretty soon I was more interested in the foot pedals than in the electric guitar, and so got more and more interested in the electronics. And through following the late 60s jam bands like Jimi Hendrix, found Miles Davis, and found Ornette Coleman, and found John Coltrane, and found John Cage, and eventually met up with Anthony Braxton, had the privilege to tour with him. And so that's my route into improvised music. And
Yeah, okay, thank you. I was just waiting because for the moment we seem to have a technical interruption. Do you hear me now, Bob?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think okay. It's
Yeah.
it's back to normal. Yeah, it's amazing that you directly got into Anthony Braxton's band and started touring with him.
I'm forever grateful. Anthony Braxton is an extraordinary human being and quite an inspiration. It's very beautiful to work with that man. He puts enormous confidence in the people he chooses to work with, and it inspires you to maybe go in over your head. He loves it when you're in over your head. And he also has a profound sense of struggle to his music, and every rehearsal and every performance is infused with this sense of struggle. And I think I learned that from him, and I've tried to carry that through in my own music as well.
We could long talk probably about all those musical projects you were involved in, but let's maybe go to another thing for a moment. Is it essential for you to also act politically in a very concrete way as a journalist and commentator, but also as an author and activist, now running a podcast also, which you might want to tell something about, rather than only being an artist, acting politically in a maybe more abstract way?
Yes, that's always been my, always had one foot in both worlds. And in the late 1970s, when I moved to New York City and was part of the East Village underground scene, I was very, that was the time Reagan was elected, and there were the civil wars in Central America, and I was very, very motivated by all of that. And it was not a time when the American avant-garde was interested in politics. In fact, it was very uncool to be interested. Now, of course, it's the complete reverse. But back then, it was hard to find space to breathe in the world of sort of underground music if you were interested in explicit political work. And that's why I ended up leaving music for 10 years and just doing more direct political work, in this case in and around the Civil War in El Salvador. I've never really bought into the idea that making art is a sort of, in the way I think of it, a political work. I mean, maybe if you're a really famous musician and your art can influence, millions of people or something, maybe I would think differently if I was in that kind of situation. But no, I've certainly made music that had addressed political themes, but I do that not because I do that because that's what I think about and that's what I'm inspired by. I don't do that because I think that's going to be any sort of real contribution to changing anybody's life for the better. And so it is important to me to always be engaged in some kind of activity that somehow has a real shot at changing the world such that those who have less get more.
That's probably exactly the point. The center of, maybe being left or whatever. But that's the core question, maybe about politics. It's true. That's really interesting.
I've never been that ideological, really, and I've always been a little bit skeptical of ideology. And yeah, I want those with less to get more, and I'd like us not to destroy the planet in the process. And you know, if those are my two North Stars.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really to the point, I think, what you say. And it also brings us directly to your book, in a way. When you approached me about your new book, you were sending, if I may cite you, greetings from the world headquarters of COVID, forest fires, and insanity in general. I'm here in Berlin, and in your introduction, you have very positive words about the city. You're referring to Berlin as an island of sanity in a crazy world. By the way, was this occasion that you are describing there, was this the last visit to Berlin? Or have you been there later again?
No, I've been back since.
Mm-hmm.
Back since. Yeah,
Same experience?
Yeah, that was the. I always find Berlin to be an island of sanity.
Mm.
Yeah. The tolerance you see in Berlin, now I understand that's changing, and I talk to my friends in Berlin now, and they say, well, you know, maybe there's, you know, new problems on the horizon here, and you know, maybe we can't take it for granted that Berlin is going to remain this island of tolerance, but it's quite beautiful. In fact, you know, I could read that opening passage of the book.
Yes, okay, that's yeah, of course, please do that.
Okay, so this is so the lead essay in the book. From 2015 to 2016, I did a one-year concert tour. Went all around the world and made a priority of performing in places where I had never been and that were off the beaten path of contemporary music touring. And so the lead essay, Facebooking the Anthropocene in Raja Ampat, is my thoughts and reflections on the experiences I had traveling around the world for a year. And it opens with this letter. Dear friends, forgive me for being such a poor correspondent during my year around the world. The daily kaleidoscope was so relentlessly compelling, I found it difficult to collect my thoughts, much less write them down. At the end of it all, I have arrived in Berlin, an island of sanity in a crazy world. More precisely, I am in the naked gay sunbathing section of the Tiergarten, Berlin's large city park. Green grass, green trees, blue sky, a lovely blanket of calm everywhere. Lots of naked men lying in the sun, families with little kids walking by. The easy mixing of naked gay men and kids on their way to get ice cream bothers no one. Beautiful Berlin. The only men not lying motionless are me and two others just to my left. One of these is in a motorized wheelchair. He has a disorder that makes it impossible for him to control his movement and is flailing around in the chair. The other man is the flailing man's caretaker, who is spoon-feeding the one in the chair. The man in the chair is naked. His caretaker, clothed, has brought him here so he can be naked in the park with the rest of the guys. The condition of the man in the chair is so severe that it is hard for him to swallow, and the quiet tranquility of the park is periodically broken by his loud and urgent choking when food goes down the wrong way. I am doing yoga. Perfect. At last I can think.
Thank you, Bob. Can you read the last sentence once again? Because in that moment we had a problem with the sound. Just the last sentence once again.
Yes. The condition of the man in the chair is so severe that it is hard for him to swallow, and the quiet tranquility of the park is periodically broken by his loud and urgent choking when the food goes down the wrong way. I am doing yoga. Perfect. At last, I can think.
Yeah, thank you. We were talking yesterday already a little bit, and I think you said it before that you were interested in telling stories, and yeah, this is kind of the first story in the book, and then when you continue to read, it's stories from all over the world from this one-year concert tour. Yeah, maybe. Could you, first of all, because the Facebook in the Anthropocene and Raja Ampat is also the title of the whole book. So it's the title of the first essay in the book. It's 3 essays all in all. But could you say, why is this the title for the whole book? What connects the title and the 3 essays?
So yes, so the first essay is this set of reflections about my experiences traveling around the world for a year. The second essay is called Are Two Dimensions Enough? And it's an older essay I wrote about 15 years ago about its stories about watching people interact with networked two-dimensional screens and noticing how people's behavior and even sense of themselves and who they were was changing. And that was at a time I had just been hired to teach in the University at California at Davis, and a lot of the work that was centered around sociology and technology was focused on this excitement about the coming of 3D immersive virtual reality and how that was going to change the world. And I wasn't convinced that 3D virtual reality was just around the corner like everybody else seemed to be. And I wasn't convinced that that was the big threshold that was going to change the world. I thought, I can see the world changing right now all around me because of networked two-dimensional screens. And the power that these screens seem to have is not the fact that they emulate the real world so precisely. It's that they're different from the real world. So I didn't think that, this vision of virtuality was really the point. And then the third essay is asks the question, what is live music? And examines the changing nature and the increasingly unstable intellectual terrain that constitutes the whole notion of live music. So what all these essays are about is our changing relationship to our technology and how that technology is changing ourselves in the process. I feel like there's a lot of writing that's been done about how quickly our technology is changing and not so much about how we're changing along with it. And like I said, in all my writing, I'm drawn to telling stories about people. I'm not somebody who's interested in theory. I'm not interested in critical theory. I'm not interested in queer theory. I'm not interested in any of that. I think ultimately what we can know about people is learn from stories about people and what we do. And so rather than produce some academic tome couched in the language of critical theory about the self and the subjectivity and the objectivity and all that. I just paid very close attention to what people around me were doing, whether I was in Raja Ampat or in a recording studio or in a park in Berlin or in a dock in Makassar. And wow, we're changing fast. we are changing really, really fast from something as fundamental as how we have sex to how we communicate, to what we communicate, and then of course the world around us, as I talk about a lot in the opening essay. The world around us is coming apart. And if you travel around the world for a year, it just leaps out at you that climate change and drought and plastics and all these things that you read about. If you actually travel around the world with your eyes open, it's just really striking. But then, of course, you see that people adapt. People learn to make their lives in the situation they're in. And those stories about how people adapt, I'm very compelled by them.
Well, I mean, this is a kind of introduction what you just gave to the first essay also. Can you tell maybe one or two stories from this first essay about how people adapt and how they also use technology to make a living, for example?
Sure. I met in Yogyakarta on the island of Java in Indonesia. I met a street kid who was living in the poorest circumstances, had been living on his own. He was a teenager, and he was making his living from his phone. He was buying and selling cell phones, and he was really savvy about which cell phone models were going to retain their value and which ones would lose their value. And he was this sort of, this one goes here and da-da-da-da-da. And he basically lived in a box. He lived in a windowless room that was just big enough for a bed. And he talked about how with his phone, that was a tolerable place to live because he was connected with the whole world. And without the phone, it was barely tolerable. And he had started out watching movies on his phone, but then he'd quickly realized that movies use up your data much faster than animations and games. So he switched to playing games. And he told me that the most interesting thing, he told me that his life ambition was to become as smart as his phone. And I said, wow, are you really so sure your phone is that smart? And he said, oh, come on, Bob. If I was as smart as my phone, I could speak every language. And he's right. Our phones now can speak every language, and they're getting better and better at it. And, he didn't know it, but that question of computers speaking natural language is right at the heart of debates about artificial intelligence and strong AI and what kind of intelligence machines can actually have. So it was so interesting to see this 16-year-old street kid living in a box, putting his finger precisely on the cutting edge philosophical question that, software engineers who are paid millions are struggling with. So that's certainly one question, or one story that comes to mind right away. I also talk a good bit in the essay about Grindr and using Grindr while I'm traveling around the world. I'm a gay guy, and using Grindr while you're traveling, particularly in cultures that are very different than yours, are it's quite fascinating. In one place, I met a guy through Grindr who had never seen a flushing toilet, and that was quite. He had a smartphone, and he had social media, and he had Grindr, but he'd never seen a flushing toilet. I thought, wow. So social media and computers are now more ubiquitous than indoor plumbing. And how fast that happened. And what that's doing to gay culture, because Grindr, these social media things are such a flattening of culture. You look on Facebook, everybody performs happiness for their social media profiles. You don't really put up pictures of yourself having a bad day. You want to, everybody creates this online virtual version of themselves that's perpetually happy and doing fun things. And as you travel around the world, you see the gestures of performing happiness have become utterly globalized. And it's sort of a meta culture that's, and then, talking to people who have gone directly from no electricity to smartphones is a fascinating, I'm from California, and we've gone from rotary phones to da-da-da-da. It's been a gradual. But there's people in the world who've gone from no electricity and no phones and no TV even, to smartphones, and they're the last people who will exist, who will be able to sit there with a phone in their hand and tell you what it was like to not have it. Because this technology is everywhere now. People who haven't seen flushing toilets have it. So this is the last generation where we're going to be able to talk to people who remember what it was like to not have a computer. And I think it's worthwhile to listen carefully to what they have to say and, record it for future generations.
Could you say something about this when you say it's so interesting to ask exactly those people who still remember or who don't have a computer to tell their stories? Because the first story that you told is, I would say, a very positive story, how somebody is able to really make a living with the means of technology only by using a phone and social media with some kind of knowledge how to do something with it to gain one's living. On the other side, you also say that the use of social media has also flattened culture, and it has also globalized, and it's also about creating this illusion of happiness in everybody. So it's not really real, maybe in a way, what's going on then. So my question is how maybe it's interesting to look at exactly this, what is left from this old world, and what do have we to take from this old world into the new world, what do you have to remember maybe. So what are you referring to tell the stories of the people who are left without the smartphones and the computers?
Well, one thing you see is that people who have gone from no electricity or very limited technology directly to smartphones are very, very competitive devices to them. And it can be disconcerting for somebody who lives next to Silicon Valley to watch them and listen to them I often think that my friends and even myself and my cultural milieu, that we lack sufficient critical distance from the technology of networked two-dimensional screens. We have an extraordinary amount of critical distance compared to people who have gone directly to smartphones. And the fact that they can make a video on their phone of themselves that looks as good as a Hollywood movie, they can put themselves in this world, this virtual world that was utterly, utterly inaccessible to them. It's very, very powerful, very, very powerful draw. And nobody takes more selfies. In my experience, nobody takes more selfies than people who've gone straight from no electricity to smartphones. And if you think people in Berlin take a lot of selfies, yeah, they're not even anywhere on the radar. And it's funny now to go to, not so long ago, I think there were places in the world where tourists would go and they'd all have their cameras or phones, to take pictures of the native people, and now the native people are all taking pictures back, but they're taking more pictures back. I really enjoy kayaking. It's one of my main sanity maintenance procedures, and I'm fortunate enough to live on the San Francisco Bay, so being out in my kayak is a thing I do quite regularly. And I actually spent 10 days kayaking through Raja Ampat, which is a quite remote archipelago of islands off the coast of New Guinea. And it was in the Philippines, where I paddled to a very remote island that was the ancestral homeland of the Tobagoan people. Very remote, and there's only 2,000 of them, and they were all on the beach playing World of Warcraft on their smartphones, and they were really into World of Warcraft, and they were in guilds, in that game, and in a lot of these massively multiplayer games, you're on teams or guilds around the world, and of course they were learning English. Everybody learns English through the internet. And in Raja Ampat, which is nationally, it's part of Indonesia. Indonesia is such a fascinating country because they speak 500 languages in Indonesia. Actually, 1/10 of the world's languages are spoken in Indonesia. And it's not dialects, they're actually distinct languages. And you can meet people who are more involved in conversations with people in Berlin than they are with people in the next village over, because the people in the next village over don't speak a different language than they speak. And so they can't talk to the next town over, but they can talk to people in Berlin or Amsterdam or San Francisco because they're all learning internet English. It'd be hard to imagine a bigger change. Just at so many levels. And then, of course, the availability of pornography. Now that any kid anywhere in the world, no matter what culture they're from, could log onto the internet and watch, gangbang porn or whatever. What a change in human culture.
My next question, this is not really in the book, but I'm always interested in improvisation and what it's about. And you told, I would say rather positive, but also difficult stories of technology. And with technology, our wish is often to reach total control about everything, one could say, about practically every aspect of our lives. And in improvisation, it is rather about accepting things to happen and about adapting to situations. Here we are even aiming for situations that we cannot entirely control in improvised music and in art. So seen from this angle, this art form is really opposite to the notion of controllability and of technology as a means, to a kind of total regulation of our lives. Can you say something about this relation, maybe?
In the third essay in the book, where we address the question of what is live music, and I talk a lot about DJs and DJ cultures and how DJ seems to perceive themselves and how other people perceive DJs. And I ask people, is a DJ, is that a live performance? You know, what is a DJ a live performance? And if you ask the question, why do you need a DJ? Why can't you just make a playlist on Spotify and hit play and have the music run all night? Why do you need this person up there with the headphones and the knobs and pretending to do all this stuff that they're not actually doing? And, you know, why? Why can't you just make an iTunes playlist? And the answer is always because the DJ has to read the room and feel the energy in the room and decide the perfect next thing to play. And basically that's a claim that the DJ is improvising, making choices in the moment, even if the only choice is I'm going to play this song next. That's improvisation. And so it's interesting not only to track the shifting content of the words live music, but also the shifting content of the notion of improvisation. In a way, you could say with the DJs of today that improvisation has become the last claim of the human being to the right to be present in the performance of music. If there was no improvising, there would be no need for the human to be there. And that's a very, very different meaning of the notion of improvisation that, I came across with Jimi Hendrix and John Coltrane and the indeterminacy of John Cage. And back then improvisation was really tied up with the notion of freedom, which was really the zeitgeist of the 1960s. Everybody wanted to be free and freedom, 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 and free music, free improvised music. Berlin was the center of the free improvised music scene and still is. And so I want to emphasize that in all these stories that I try to keep track of, the story of an idea, or the story of a person, or the story of a culture, my point is never to make normative judgments and to say that one meaning of improvisation was the right one and everybody else got it wrong. Live music is the correct one and everybody else got it wrong, or one is superior or one is inferior. But I do think they track changes in human culture, and it's worthwhile to notice the changes. You know, at the end of the day, I guess I'm a historian, and I care about history, and the job of the historian is to try to sort out what's new and what's the same old shit. And so tracking these things is something I'm interested in. And I'm also interested in how, now that technology is changing so fast, how as you get older, you can experience things with a sense of loss that younger people don't have, because we, you know, when we come of age in this world, we take the world we find as the benchmark. That's the given. And we start building from there. We build our lives and the meaning of our lives from the basis of the world we find. So it's creating such a the fact that our world is more and more the fact that the world we find is more and more a world that's created by technology. The world we find has less and less to do with trees and bugs and snakes and butterflies, and more to do with screens and computers and Wi-Fi networks. And that world changes so fast that, yeah, as people come of age and learn to make sense of their world and their sense of who they are and who they are in the world based on that benchmark, and that benchmark is changing so rapidly. You know, I talk to 25-year-olds who feel like they can't talk to 18-year-olds because there's too much of a generational difference between them. And, you know, this is a new thing. This is a new thing. I remember, you know, when I was a kid in the 60s in the United States, there was all this talk of the generation gap. And, you know, why was it that the parents couldn't understand their kids? And it must be because of the Vietnam War, or it must be because the kids are taking psychedelic drugs, or it must be because of this new sexual freedom. But the idea was that there was something particular about that 60s generation that created this generation gap, and that was going to be this special generation. I think actually what that indicated was that the 60s were the time when the rate of technological change acquired a velocity such that parents could hardly talk to their kids. But that wasn't a one-time thing. That's only become more pronounced, and the generations are going by faster and faster.
So your thesis is also that technology really affects identity of the people.
Oh, yes, very, very much. Very, very much. And I think we're about to get into a new, well, certainly photographs have changed people's sense of self. The ubiquity of photography in our lives has changed people's sense of self. You know, it's interesting to go back. In the 1960s, Susan Sontag wrote a very famous book called On Photography, where she talked about how photography was changing culture. And it's, you know, considered a classic and so prescient in its, you know, anticipation. Nowhere does she talk about people taking pictures of themselves. Like, this is how new that is. I spent 10 years in Central America. I don't have a single photograph of myself. And social media. And a lot of that time I was hanging out with photojournalists who had like 10 different cameras hanging around their necks. And we just didn't take pictures of ourselves. We took pictures of everything else. And I remember a while ago, there was a record label in Taiwan that released some unreleased music of mine from the 1980s or from the late 70s, early 80s. And they wanted me to send photographs. And I went back and I realized, wow, between the ages of 18 and 33, I have 4 pictures of myself. And I only had those pictures because they were in reviews of concerts that I had clipped out of the newspaper and saved. And of course, you know, we take 4 pictures of ourselves an hour now. And that's changed, so much. But I think what's going to happen, the next thing that's going to happen, of course, another thing that changes our sense of self is social media and likes, counting likes on social media. You know, there's a metric now. You can measure popularity of everything you do. You can measure the popularity of how you brush your teeth. You can, you know, anything. And I think the next step is going to be once AI enters the loop of the creation of identity. And I think the people who come of age forming their sense of self by chatting with algorithms rather than other people are going to be very different people than you and I. And I mean, that's fine. That's going to happen. And I don't think it's good or bad, but it draws my attention. It's fascinating as part of the human story. Already in the United States, I was just reading about this national suicide hotline for LGBT kids, and they're starting to incorporate AI algorithms in that. And well, there you go. There's forming a sense of self by interacting with algorithms. Yeah, I think that's on the horizon.
Yeah, it's happening. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've shortly been talking about the third essay now also, about the question of what is life. I'm wondering if we should go back to this question a little bit. It's just so interesting how you develop this whole story with talking about DJs, and then there's also the subtitle, "Many would die to see her live." And talking about AI, maybe that's interesting to also tell this story.
Yeah, well, the essay ends, I end up talking about Hatsune Miku, who's a Japanese Vocaloid. And for those who don't know, a Vocaloid is just a piece of software. It's like a plug-in. So if you're using Ableton Live or some digital music software like that, you get this plug-in. It's like a plug-in software synthesizer. And you can type in, you write a melody line, and then you type in the lyrics. And this is a vocal synthesizer that will generate a voice singing the words that you type in. And the most popular one is known as Hatsune Miku. It was created by a Japanese software company. And all they created was this piece of code that generates a voice that allegedly sounds like a 16-year-old Japanese girl singing, according to the company. Now, nobody is going to mistake the sound of the Hatsune Miku Vocaloid for the sound of an actual 16-year-old girl singing. But this is sort of one of the things I keep trying to get at in the book, and particularly in the second essay, Are Two Dimensions Enough? it isn't necessary that the thing that's generated on the screen or by the computer is so convincingly real. That's not the basis of its appeal. I don't think the Hatsune Miku Vocaloid would be more compelling if it sounded more convincingly like a real 16-year-old girl. It sounds like a Vocaloid. And so the company released this software. Well, kids all over the place started writing songs featuring Hatsune Miku vocals. And somebody made a piece of animation software that made it easy to take the anime girl that was drawn on the box cover of the software and make music videos out of it. And now there's, well over 100,000, I think, Hatsune Miku songs on YouTube. Hatsune Miku is now the most prolific musician in the history of the world. And
even that, yeah.
and you know, it's so interesting because I remember at the beginning of computer music and computer art, and those of us who were involved at the time said, wow, if you think this through, there might come a time where it will be possible to use this technology to make artistic collaborations on a scale that we've never been able to do before. And won't that be a beautiful thing? You know? Well, here it is. Here is 100,000 people collaborating on the same art project. I mean, that is what we imagined. We never imagined it would take the form of a 16-year-old anime Japanese girl in pigtails and a miniskirt singing J-pop. But there it is. And then she started doing concerts, and she performs as a hologram. And it's enormously popular. People, she draws huge crowds, and the crowds, they all come. There's a whole way to do it. You're supposed to bring a flashlight and wave it a certain way, and it's very meaningful for her fans. And yes, the title comes from, she was booked to open for Lady Gaga, and there was the concert was put up on YouTube, and the American Lady Gaga fans, the concert was in the United States, the American Lady Gaga fans, you know, didn't react with the over-the-top enthusiasm that many Asian fans, and so there were a lot of Asian kids that were typing in the comments section, you know, just furious that she was being so disrespected. And one boy wrote in, you know, don't they realize, you know, that many would die to see her live? And well, there you have it, a live performance of a Vocaloid. What does live music mean? Well, can a Vocaloid hologram do a live performance? And do you have to have an actual human being involved to have a live performance? Hatsune Miku would say no. And the kid who wrote that comment, that many would die to see her live, would say no. I made you know, for a while as I was traveling around, I would ask people, you know, I would say, think about the last time you said live music, like when you said, oh, I love going to live music shows, or, you know, I miss live music because of COVID, or, you know, what did you mean? So, Mathias, when was the last time you said live music, and what did you mean?
When was the last time? Okay, so that's a question for me now. Well, actually, I find this question also really fascinating, and I very much enjoyed reading this third essay because it really goes totally in opening the notion of liveness as it used to be. I mean, there's the classic notion of liveness, of temporal and spatial being together and co-presence and experience something together. And I mean, you still have this in there, and it's even topped by all this act of participation, as you said. It's true also in improvised music or in performance art and so on. We have this notion, what you said with computer music, that participation of the audience is a really, really important aspect of the whole thing. And as you said, yeah, there you have it. And so it's true. You only need a Vocaloid and a hologram, and it can work as well. For me, of course, there's nothing more live than free improvisation, if I may say. And but what does it mean? I mean, of course, it's attending a concert and it's experiencing the moment together. The improvisation really lives from the situation and from what is created in the very moment. And that can be very special. But the question is it possible to have the same experience also in a recorded version of an improvisation? Because when you know the whole thing, of course, you can imagine yourself how it was in the concert. And then I would say liveness is something that you experience in yourself. So it's not really connected to the temporal and spatial co-presence and whatever, but it's also when you read a book, I mean, you read it in the moment that you read it yourselves and you read it maybe for the first time. And so liveness can be something all around the place because it's about your own experience in the end. Yeah, but that is what makes it so interesting also with these questions, also about the knob syncing and the lip syncing and when is something live and so on. Yeah.
Yes, knob syncing was a term I came up with. So it's interesting. Well, there's so many interesting things about DJs. One thing that's interesting about DJs is that for all the talk about how difficult it is for musicians to make a living now, the top paid DJs are probably the best paid musicians in the history of the world. So that's a curious dichotomy already. And it's also curious that if you watch DJs, they're often faking it. You can see they're turning knobs that have no effect on the music whatsoever. And it's interesting to compare that to lip syncing. Now that we have RuPaul's Drag Race and so forth, drag queen lip syncing is a well-known phenomena to everybody. And if you lip sync, you have to practice because when you hear the singer sing, you have a pretty good idea of what their mouth was going to have to be doing to make that sound. So you have to actually practice. But knob syncing, you can't miss because who knows when the knob was turned, when that track was actually made. So you can just knob turn at any old time and pretend that you're having an effect on the music, and nobody can say you're not, or unless you're really familiar with how the technology works, nobody can say you're not. So knob syncing is sort of a can't miss activity. I would when I would ask people what they meant by live music, if they had a hard time answering, I would say, okay, so if I go on stage and press play, is that a live performance? And usually people would say no. And then I would say, what if I press play and turn one knob? And then I would say, how many knobs do I have to turn before it's live? And, that was an interesting way to focus the conversation. I had some lovely answers. Chris Cutler, who perhaps some of the listeners know of as a percussionist, English percussionist and essayist. He gave an answer. His answer was, if the performance can fail on aesthetic rather than technical grounds, it's a live performance. I thought that was an interesting answer. And Geo Wyeth, a musician and artist, said, if you're staring at a screen, it's not live. And I really liked that definition because it resonated so strongly with me. I can't stand going to a concert where people are staring at laptop screens. I just can't stand it. And it doesn't feel live to me to watch somebody stare at a laptop screen. And I was thinking about it, why is that? And I said, well, Geo, you know, in the 80s, I had a keyboard synthesizer and it had a little LCD screen, you know, was that live when I was playing that keyboard and staring at that screen? And Geo said, no, that was live. And I said, well, so how big does the screen have to be before it's not live? And by the way, the definition I settled on for myself, die of heart attacks and the music doesn't stop, then it's not live.
Okay. Bob, can you say this again, please? Because just now there was interruption again. Your definition.
Yes, if all the musicians can die of heart attacks and the music doesn't stop, then it's not live.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Very good definition. Yeah. Okay, that was already, yeah, Bob. That was already really interesting to talk about the chapters in the book and everything. And of course, I would recommend it to everybody to read it because it's really worth reading the essays. Maybe we can go to your music and talk about your work a little bit. And now we were talking about live music, and maybe it's also possible to say that you are working. No, I mean, no, it's about performance. I mean, at least you are working as improvising musician, and you also play solo performances with the synthesizer. And obviously, when you perform, it's pretty live, I would say. But you're also working as a composer. I don't know, maybe this is in a way more abstract, your work as a synthesizer player. But when you're working as a composer or producer of pieces, then I think it's really, really fascinating that there's always a lot of meaning and social political references involved in this whole thing. And you were mentioning it in the beginning already, that you are rather inspired by this than that actually with your art you would like to make a political statement or something like this. But still, it's very concrete, the different things that you take from your own experience and from politics and so on, to make music from it. And I think that this is something very, very exciting for somebody who is deeply rooted also in the free music scene and so on, playing rather abstract, pure music sounds and so on. So maybe we could talk about a few examples. We also have a question in the comments here. There's somebody who really wanted to know something about the piece Sooner or Later. If I may just read this comment. Dear Bob, I came across your work for the first time during my musical studies. It was Sooner or Later. I'm still pretty impressed. Could you maybe say some words about this work? Thanks, from Anton. And actually, I also wanted to start asking you about Sooner or Later, because this is kind of the classic electronic music piece. And we can talk about a few more, but maybe that's a good start.
Before we do that, I want to back up. You said that you thought my music was pretty live. And you know, I always wonder, and I think it's a good example of how people take the world they come of age in as the benchmark. So I wasn't the first person to take a modular analog synthesizer on stage and play it, but I think I was the first person to sort of use a modular analog synthesizer as my regular acts in a free improvised music scene.
Exactly.
And always go on, with saxophone players and drummers. And I was unsure whether what I was doing was really a live performance. It certainly wasn't like playing a saxophone or playing a drum set. And I would ask myself, what am I doing here? Like, I don't have a special ability to turn a knob. Like, I can't turn a knob better than anybody else can. So what is the thing that I'm bringing? And that's why in the early days when I was playing the modular synthesizer, I rarely did solo concerts because I was insecure about whether that was really a live performance. I wanted somebody next to me plucking a string or blowing on a tube or hitting a drum head or something. Now, the modular synthesizers, the question of improvisation wasn't really a question because you couldn't do the same thing twice with those. So the improvisation was built in, and that was sort of why it made sense to play one in an improvised music scene. And then I left music for 10 years, went to Central America. When I came back to music, the MIDI revolution had happened. And now you could go on stage with an electronic instrument and play the exact same thing, exactly the same way. And it posed the question again of, well, what's live? And when I started playing Sooner or Later, for example, that was the first time I started playing a composition on stage. And I wasn't sure about the liveness. Like, I could have just hit play. It's up to you with that technology, it's up to you. You could just hit play, or you could just have everything set so you hit this key and then this key and then this key and then the whole composition. It's like sort of arbitrary where you stage your intervention online. Anyway.
But I think we cannot really answer this question ontologically. I mean, there are so many aspects that can contribute to the experience of liveness, but also acousmatic, electroacoustic performance where nobody on stage is and you only have the speakers. Of course, when there's audience together, then that's it. It can be referred to as something live. And you even, maybe somebody hits the play button, but then you still have the live electronic and spatialization and everything. So yeah, it's gradual.
What was striking to me was that when I see the DJs now, in a sense, I'm the precursor of, the people who go on stage now and turn knobs, in a way, I'm the precursor of that. And it's so striking to me that they have no doubt that what they're doing is live and that I did. And well, there's a change. And that's an interesting change to note. Like, their understanding of what they're doing is so different from mine. And not to say that one is right and one is wrong, but to say, well, the world changed. Sooner or Later is a piece I made from a recording of a young boy in El Salvador burying his father who had been killed by government soldiers. And it's in two movements. In the first movement, the only sounds you hear are the sounds from the recording. And it's a short recording. So you hear the boy talking about his father. You hear the shovel digging the hole in the ground where they're about to put the body in, and you hear a fly buzzing around the microphone, and then you hear a woman crying. So all the sound, the whole composition is made from those sounds. in the second movement, I add a very, very brief sample of Fred Frith's guitar playing, but again, most of the sound is from the recording. So that's the piece, and that was sort of I made that as sort of my personal transition out of Central America. That was a rough time. That was, it's funny, those countries are so small, and the time has gone by, so those wars aren't even hardly remembered. But the Civil War in El Salvador was quite a horrendous, bloody affair. Very much rich against poor. It was. I think it would be hard to find more of a class war than the Civil War in El Salvador. So lots of deaths. 70,000 people got killed in a country of only 5 million inhabitants. So when I left that work and went back to playing music, I wanted to, make some sort of piece that would be, help me make that transition. So that's the piece I made. I played it for a couple of years, then I stopped. It's very, very, very sad piece, and it's not the some kind of thing you want to play every night. It's not. I didn't want it to become routine for me. Like if I was playing it enough that it stopped being an emotional experience, then I felt like I was playing it too much. So I stopped playing it for many years, and then in 2015 I was invited to play it at a tiny little music festival in a dusty campesino mountain town in El Salvador, not far from where the boy's father was actually buried. So I wanted to do that, so I kind of resurrected the piece and went to play it in El Salvador, and then I've played it a little bit since then in a few different venues around the world. It was very very interesting experience to, that sort of piece, people would hear it at different levels. Like if you hear it and you don't speak Spanish, you sort of hear it as, generic sadness. And if you speak Spanish, then you hear it as something more specific. And then if you're from Central America, you hear it as something even more specific. And if you were in that village, you hear it even differently again. And that war ended up with a negotiated settlement. The Army of the Poor it came to terms with the fact that the American government was giving a blank check to the regime, and there was just no way, no matter how many helicopters they shot down, the U.S. was going to send more helicopters. For a long time, the United States was giving $1 million a day in military aid to a country of 5 million people. That's what it took to keep that regime afloat. And then the regime and the Americans had to come to terms with the fact that they were not going to annihilate the revolutionary movement. And so finally, there was a negotiated settlement, which was very difficult because so many people had died, and it was hard to not want vengeance. And so there was a very fraught and difficult process of trying to put the war behind them and trying to move the political struggle to non-military plane. What I had completely not anticipated was that in the piece, when the boy is talking about his father, he talks about wanting to avenge his father. That's where the title comes from. The last thing the boy says is, sooner or later, I'm going to get the bastards who did this. And that's exactly the emotion that the Salvadorans have been trying to leave behind, and to come to terms with the fact that sooner or later they are not going to get the people who caused that death. So it was a pretty jarring experience to, to do that.
I can imagine. There are two more questions here in the chat on the piece. So Anton is also asking, how did you record this? Were people aware of you recording?
So I did not record it. A filmmaker friend he was Puerto Rican, and he was sort of, I guess now we would say, embedded. He was a filmmaker who was embedded with the Revolutionary Army. And he was making documentaries that were specifically to be used for raising money for the Revolutionary Army. And he recorded it, and he gave me the recording. And when I decided I was going to make a piece about it, I thought, well, I should ask, see if I was told the boy had been killed subsequently, and that there was nobody to ask permission from, but that he had been aware that the event was being recorded, and that the recording would somehow be used in a way to advance the cause, and that that was what there was. So that was a ethical choice to make art out of such a intense moment of somebody's life without them even knowing that the art was being made out of it. And ultimately I decided that my filmmaker friend was right, that he had been aware that he had been being recorded, and that was fine. And that ultimately I thought, well, if I make a good piece, then I have the right to do it. And if I make a bad piece, I don't have the right to do it. And I mean, it's on the edge. It's on the edge. Yeah.
There's a second question, which is maybe not so easy to answer. Let's just maybe quickly go to it. The question is about how is it for the listeners to attend the piece? And the question even goes so far to ask if it rather helps or triggers PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Can you say something about this?
Yeah. Oftentimes, when I have played that piece, particularly in the early days, when the war was still going on, oftentimes when I played that piece, some people in the audience would, I remember one man was furious, was like really angry, like he felt like he had sort of been assaulted. He felt like by showing up to the concert, he was not consenting to be put through such a raw emotional experience. There were times where it was played on the radio, where people called in during the playing of the piece and asked the radio station to stop it. And then, of course, many, really positive experiences from many people. I decided was okay with. I would always normally I don't like talking about my music during a concert. I think the music should speak for itself, and music that has to be somehow explained to an audience, in my view, it sort of failed. So in general, I do not talk about, but that's the only piece where I actually do, before I play that piece, I explain where it came from, explain the whole thing. I explain it's going to be very sad. If people leave during the performance, I'm not offended. If this is not for you, I get it. Yeah. And I don't play it very often. And I certainly don't listen to it at home while I'm doing the dishes. No, it's, yeah.
I would maybe like to talk about one or two more of those pieces of yours, because it's really informative what you are telling us about this. Before, there's also a question which a little bit relates to this from somebody from the chat also. The question is, how do you value recording records and jam on stage? So this is maybe really also about what is composing such a piece for you and what is improvising with other musicians.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you say again?
I will read it again. How do you value recording records and jam on stage? I think it's maybe about the difference of being in a studio and on being on a stage.
Well, so we could take that question in a lot of different ways. One way we could take it is, I don't record improvisations anymore, and I haven't for a long time. And that's another thing where the context has changed so much. When I started doing free improvised concerts and recordings, I think it was 1978. And the number of records of improvised music that there were in the whole world, you could put on a very small bookshelf. And it was a very focused sort of international community of musicians who were doing that. And if you put out a record of a new record of improvised music, everybody would get it, and there would be one more record on the shelf next to the other 15 or whatever. Now that we can record with our phones and post it directly to YouTube, there's such an avalanche of recordings of improvised music that nobody could possibly listen to that. So I don't record improvised concerts anymore. I don't want to go back and listen to them. I think it's useful for a young player, learning their craft, to go back over and hear what worked and what didn't work. And yeah. Also, when it comes to improvised music, I've learned that when I first started recording improvised concerts, I was always surprised a bit by the recordings. Sometimes the concerts I didn't think went very well. I thought the recordings were really good. And sometimes the concerts I thought went really well. And at first I thought, well, I just wasn't paying attention during that concert. I need to listen more closely. And then I decided, no, it's just a different experience, like what works during a concert. You can't listen to a recording of improvised music and sort of capture the sense that somebody is really making choices. And maybe the reason there's a silence there is because they were about to play one thing and then they changed their mind and put that down and did something else. And you're watching all of that process, which is not present in an audio recording.
And it also shows how much our perception can vary from one moment to the other when you're re-listening to an audience that you have experienced before. That's true. What should we choose? I mean, I was thinking of Voice of America maybe, or All the Rage, Yugoslavia Suite. I mean, you can choose anything which you think is interesting to outline the context you are referring to in your works.
Let's talk about A Book of Hours.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's my most recent sort of
Yeah.
composition. And so in the 90s, I had a group called Say No More, and I developed a particular compositional method for Say No More. And that I started that quartet right when the first, right when computers got fast enough to play back audio. And so in that time, in the early 90s, you could edit, you could do the digital equivalent of a tape splice, but not really much else to the sound. So I took 4 musicians, Gerry Hemingway and Mark Dresser and Phil Minton, and they each recorded solos, improvised solos. I took the solos, put them into the computer, snipped them up into little fragments, assembled the fragments into compositions. So I sort of created a band on the computer out of the fragments of their improvisational solos and released that as the group's first record. And then I gave that record back to them and said, okay, treat this recording as the score, learn your part. And then, so they had to go back through and listen to their own improvisations as sliced and diced by me. And then we got together, rehearsed it, toured with it, and recorded a live recording. So that became the second record. So that was the live group playing the compositions made on the computer out of the fragments of the live improvisation. I took the live performance, put that back into the computer, cut it all up, made a new piece, released that as a record. So that was the computer version, the computer composition made out of the live performance, which was made out of the computer version, which was made out of the solos. And so it was a cycle that kept going that way. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a successful experiment in the sense that I thought we developed a body of work that could not have been arrived at through any other means. And it was a body of work in which you couldn't really answer the question which part was improvised and which part was composed. It was all improvised and it was all composed, and the question became essentially meaningless. And I also think it was interesting for the musicians because you take somebody like Phil Minton, and usually, Phil is put in a situation where he's a vocalist. For those of you who don't know him, has this extraordinary extended range of vocal techniques. Normally, he would be put in a situation where it was just an improvised gig, or he'd be, put into somebody's band where he would sort of have to sing a normal song, and then maybe there was a section in the middle where he could do his extended vocal techniques. Well, for all of them, this was the first time they could bring the complete body of extended techniques they had developed for improvisation and bring those to bear on a composed, in a scenario of composed music. So it was interesting for everybody. It created a different relationship between the composer and the musicians, like whose music was it? And so at the time, it was very hard to book that group, by the way. Jazz festivals didn't want us because they thought we were killing the spirit of improvisation by running it through a computer. And computer music festivals didn't want us because we had a trap set and it sort of swung. And so, like, obviously that wasn't computer music. I remember submitting it to an electroacoustic music festival, and they said it wasn't electroacoustic music. I said, wait a minute, it's acoustic and then electric and then acoustic. Like what could be more? Anyway, it didn't fit in anybody's box.
Yeah, it tells a lot about the notion of purity in music.
So that was like pushing water uphill.
Yeah.
I finally gave that up. So now, of course, computers are fast enough and the software is such that you can do much more than just splice. You can time stretch and pitch shift and so forth. Since I couldn't do any of that back in the 90s, I chose trap set, contrabass, and Phil Minton's extended vocals because none of it was really that precisely pitched, or the registers were so far between what Phil was doing and what Mark Dresser was doing on the contrabass that I didn't really have to worry about getting stuff in tune and in harmony that was improvised in a separate way or in separate occasions. So I thought, well, now that you can pitch shift and time stretch, this makes this, I could revisit this technique and have many more tools. So I did a vocal piece. So it's Theo Bleckman, a fantastic singer, Shelley Hirsch, and Phil Minton, all extraordinary vocalists with extraordinary toolkits of extended techniques. And then Roscoe Mitchell on wind instruments. I was very, very honored to have Roscoe. And I did very, very, very slight pitch shifting. Not so that anybody, ended up sounding like they were singing higher than they can sing or lower than they can sing or anything like that. Just trying to tweak the fragments a little bit so that they fit together in a harmonic way. And I was very happy with the result. And it was a commission from WDR, Cologne. And of course, that's, where Stockhausen was based out of during, the heyday of Stockhausen. And I thought about, I went back and listened to his piece, Gesang der Dschungel. You can say it in German better than I can.
No, that was pretty close already.
And, that piece is considered an electronic music classic. And what Stockhausen did, it was quite incredible what he did. It was in the early days of electronic music. And he, by using, very primitive oscillators, he sort of assembled a collection of synthesized vowels and nouns, and then he recorded this boy singing a song, and then he would segue back and forth between the boy's voice and his synthesized version of the boy's voice. And if you look at what Stockhausen said about the piece, he said that it was that the future of timbral exploration in music was going to be entirely electronic, because everything that could be done with acoustic instruments had been done. And I thought, that's quite incredible, because he wrote that just before this incredible explosion of, Evan Parker and Roscoe Mitchell and the Art Ensemble of Chicago and prepared guitar, and this unprecedented explosion of new timbres coming out of acoustic instruments that really had no precedent. And wow, you couldn't be more wrong. And in his view, it didn't matter whose voice you used. because all the interesting stuff was going to happen with the electronics. So you just get some boy to sing a song. You know, it didn't matter. Because and I thought, no, it matters. And I thought, so how did he get that so wrong? And I thought, well, this whole explosion of extended technique was not something that was discoverable by a composer sitting and composing. You could not learn, you couldn't do what Derek Bailey did with a guitar, or what Anthony Braxton did with a saxophone, or what Roscoe Mitchell did with a saxophone, or what Lester Bowie did with a trumpet. You couldn't do that by sitting with a piece of paper and staff, or even sitting with a synthesizer. You could only do that through a very, very intensive confrontation between your body and the instrument over a period of years. It was not something that was available to a composer. So I subtitled my piece "Song of the Elders" because I wanted to make the point that my answer to Stockhausen was that no, it matters who the singer is, and that's actually the important point. And then of course his composition was sort of steeped in his sort of odd take on Catholicism and religion, and so I decided I would make my piece based on my odd take on religion. So I call it devotional music to nothing in particular. or gospel music for the godless. And I titled the different movements. I looked through the Psalms and found lines from Psalms that made no mention of God. I really thought of it as a answer back to Stockhausen, and I'm very, very proud of the result. We only performed it twice. We did it at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, and we did it at a music festival in Prague. I'm older now, and I'm not. I would have to be very, very motivated to hustle enough to find money to support touring with 4 musicians, and and also I'm trying to cut down my carbon footprint. So less live concerts. That was pretty live. That was three voices. That was pretty live. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy you chose this example, because it was really, really interesting what you told us about it. And yeah, now you also talk of the consequences and of reducing your carbon footprint. So maybe we can go back to the initial question of how technology changes us, and what the consequences are of technology. So maybe we can talk about when we what consequences you personally deem necessary as a result of reflecting the power of technology over humanity, maybe as a person, but also in your art.
I think you went over my head there. Can you explain?
Okay, maybe we can start with a question from the chat once more, and then I come back to my question once again, because this a little bit relates to this to my question. So the question is, when you speak about screens, does that mean you are not performing on or with a laptop anymore?
Yes, I absolutely don't play with a laptop anymore. Well, if I'm playing with a laptop, the laptop is not on the stage, and I can't see the screen.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, most of my concerts are done with a gamepad now, and It's interesting, you know, in the late 70s, there was that whole debate about whether to put keyboards on synthesizers, and I very much sided with the Don Buchla camp that you shouldn't put keyboards on synthesizers. And we very much look forward to these alternative controllers that were going to appear, that were going to allow us to manipulate sound in all these interesting ways. And here we are, decades later, and I think it's by and large been disappointing. There's no controller that I know of that has become what I would think of as a real mature instrument, in the sense that one would be inspired to spend hours a day for 15 years learning to master it. The only electronic instruments that I can think of that would meet that bar are the theremin, which is 100 years old, and the electric guitar and the turntable. I mean, certainly there's turntablists who have a level of virtuosity that's... but the interesting thing about electric guitars and turntables is they're not really electronic instruments, in the sense that there's a physical thing vibrating that you can touch. The only thing the electronics doing are amplifying a sound that's so quiet you wouldn't really be able to hear it, but you get to touch the thing that's actually making the sound. When we think of controllers, we think of a device that we can touch that then has an arbitrary connection to the sound generator. So you could use any controller to control any synthesizer. So there's not this one-to-one thing between touching and making sound. And so I've tried almost so many different controllers, some of them costing thousands of dollars, and I've always found them lacking. And so I settled on the gamepad because it's really cheap. And if it breaks, you can just go to the store and buy another one for 20 euros. And you don't have to look at it. You can play on stage with your eyes closed. And it's enough. I found it's enough. I found it's, I understand why, after all that research and development, the computer game companies settled on the gamepad. It fits well in your hands, and, a whole bunch of buttons and two XY joysticks. That's about as much as I can keep track of. So yes, I play most of my concerts now with the gamepad, and I have no screen, and I play with my eyes closed. And yeah, the gamepad also has the advantage that at this point, almost anybody below a certain age has had a gamepad in their hands at some point or another. So it's almost like watching somebody play a piano back in the day, where everybody took piano lessons. Like, there was some, so often with electronic music, people have no idea what the heck you're doing up there. And with a gamepad, they at least see, oh, he's got a gamepad and he's moving those buttons and so forth. So I like it at that level as well.
Okay, so that was, one could say, a consequence of maybe not wanting to use the screen in your own way of playing. And I was wondering if, from everything that you describe in your book, what you've been witnessing, how technology changes humanity, if you have taken personal consequences where you say, okay, this is what I don't want to do, or where you worship the possibilities of technology.
I'm probably just as addicted to my smartphone as everybody else. It's amazing how hard these things are to put down. Like I said, I'm less and less motivated to keep up with the technology in terms of making art. And that's certainly something that I think if you could go back to the late 70s to when I was coming of age and the first personal computers and all that, I think the unstable nature of digital technology was not something that anybody anticipated. That you would constantly be changing and upgrading, and the old thing would become obsolete, and the file that you had last year, you wouldn't even be able to open it anymore because it's not compatible with the new thing, and all that was unanticipated. Younger folks, they're so fascinated with Euro racks and modular synthesizers, and oftentimes they tell me that what they really like is the sound, and I'm not, the current crop of digital synthesizers sound pretty good, but you can't do your email on a Euro rack, and you can't do your Facebook on a Euro rack, and it doesn't interrupt you to say it upgraded the operating system last night, and all, so yeah, the main thing is that I'm not motivated to I'm stepping away from making that kind of art and stepping towards writing. But anyway, there's 20-some CDs of my stuff out there, and I'm not sure what the world needs is another one of my CDs. There's so many young people making really interesting work, and I'm quite happy to listen to what they're doing.
Yeah. Maybe one last thing. I mean, you said that one consequence for yourself, and I think for many, is that actually also through the COVID crisis, many people are thinking about really reducing the carbon footprint and about not traveling that much anymore. And that will for sure affect also the scene of contemporary music. And we are facing new formats. The fact that we are doing this talk between Berlin and San Francisco is not necessarily a consequence of this, but also it was triggered through this, of course. Just maybe the book was one of your last projects. What are you doing at the moment? I was mentioning the podcast that you are doing, for example. Just that we hear from you. What you are occupied with now? What's the next project and so on?
So I have a podcast with my dear friend Maureen Taylor, who is a social worker in Detroit, Michigan, and she is a fierce force of nature, and she is very articulate about poverty in the United States. She works with some of the poorest people in the United States. We have a podcast called What's Been Done and What's Been Won, and we talk about contemporary events in American politics. So that's a lovely thing. I'm about to start a second podcast, which will be oral histories of queer people, because I care a lot that as queer culture changes and as we add more letters to the LGBT, that we kind of forget. So I just, more and more interested in history. And I have a few different books underway in various stages of disrepair. One of them is a novel, which I keep working on and putting away and working on and putting away. One is a book about men. It's going to be called Encounters with Men. And it's just going to be stories of men I've encountered. That takes us back to where we started, stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we tell stories, and that's really where my interest lies and where I think I can learn the most is by listening to people and telling their stories.
Yes. Okay. So you were, we were talking about your new book now, Facebook and the Anthropocene and Raja Ampat, and there are several more, and they are all worth a read. From what I was able to read up till now. You also have them here. If you want to show your books quickly.
Sure.
Just,
The one
so
before here, so here's Facebooking, the
mm-hmm.
Anthropocene, that's the newest one. This is the one I did just before that. Sex, Science, Self, A Social History of Estrogen, Testosterone, and Identity. And this is very much, I mean, it may sound like a book about the social history of hormones is kind of an outlier, but actually, to me, it's very much along this same line of how technology is changing our sense of ourselves and who we are. Before that, there's a book called Raising Expectations and Raising Hell, My Decade Fighting for the Labor Movement by Jane McAlevey and myself. She's a dear friend of mine who is a labor organizer, and this is stories of her work in the union movement, and this was named the most important book of 2012 by The Nation magazine. Before that was Creative Life, Music, Politics, People, and Machines. This is just a series of essays about everything I think about. Before that was People's Movements, People's Press, the Journalism of Social Justice Movements in the United States, a history of radical journalism in America. Before that was the Yes Men. The Yes Men were a sort of guerrilla media collective that I used to be a part of a long time ago. There's a, I left out actually the most recent one before Facebooking is only an ebook. It's a free ebook download, and it's called, what is it called? It's a free ebook download on how to develop a home yoga practice while locked down in quarantine. And how to develop your own yoga practice without spending a lot of money or injuring yourself. And that's only available as an ebook and a PDF, and it costs nothing. And
all right. I would really like to thank you very much, Bob, for this really nice and instructive talk. I've also learned a lot from you, and thanks a lot for everybody following our live stream, and also for the questions in the chat. If you are interested in what I do at Exploratorium, please check our Denkraum Improvisation pages, think improvisation pages in English, and there you can also look at the YouTube playlist, Talk and Improvisation, where you can find recent talks with Magda Myers, Richard Scott talking on John Stevens, Silvana Figueroa Adrea, Mazen Karbash, and Ursel Schlicht up till now. And the next one, it is coming up on April 22. It's going to be with double bassist Adam Puls-Melby, and we'll be talking about materiality and resonance. And he will be also presenting the Farb, an instrument which he's playing, a feedback actuated double bass, actually. So please join in case you are interested. You have all the information on our Exploratorium page. So thank you very much for watching, and all the best to everybody.
I should, if I could say one more
Please.
thing. All my music is available for free. Just go to my website, download away, cut and copy and manipulate and mutilate, and sample and have it.
Okay, that's another interesting question because once you said you were talking about the making music free, and then later you said, well, maybe it was not such a good idea, but today we are not going to continue this story. Thanks a lot,
Yeah.
Bob.
Another time.